Hello, have you? Bet you have. Hello, I am Sydney Winston. Have you ever had one of those nights where you're just not tired, you're not sleepy, you don't want to go to bed, you're up, so you decide, I guess I'm talking for myself here, decide, oh, let's go online. Let's watch something, let's get some entertainment. But then, we've been watching Shannon and Jason, Shani and Reb, we've been watching Darth Dawkins and Canadian Catholic and all these kind of low-life, trashy, bottom-of-the-barrel people. Well, that doesn't change the fact that right now I'm not tired, I haven't gone to sleep, I can't. So, instead of going down to the trash and dragging up some Darth Dawkins or other trash like Nephilim Free or Shani for Christ or Revelation News or just, garbage, Mr. Batman. I thought, listen to a little bit of Aron Ra. Aron Ra to me is the most reasonable, rational, and prolific atheist on YouTube. Certainly the most prolific, and obviously the most the one most people are able to reach out to because he talks and mixes with people right across the spectrum, even down to people like Canadian Catholic, as I pointed out in one of yesterday's broadcasts. So today I thought let's kick it up a notch and let's forget about the Christians. The Christians are absolute garbage. So what I'm going to do is allow Mr. Aron Ra to talk for a while about or against the theist claim that they know that there's a God and they claim that everybody knows that there's a God. Well, I do believe that Aron Ra has something different to say on that matter. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Aron Ra. I'm a secular activist on the board of American Atheists. But I live in Dallas, Texas, the most religious city in the United States, where nearly half the population identify as highly religious Christians. In other words, when I'm online at the grocery store, the person ahead of me and the cashier are both science-denying creationists. That's why we have 1,200 churches and several dozen megachurches. Now, those are the ones with congregations numbering multiple thousands. For example, Dallas is home to Bishop T.D. Jakes of the Potter's House.
What really made you great is suffering with little or nothing.
But we have some other colorful characters too, like the politically bigoted Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Church.
Let's pray together, may we?
And the notorious Kenneth Copeland of Believer's Voice of Victory.
You get that tithe in that church, you get that offering in that church, and then you go home and you do what we're supposed to do.
And back in the 80s, we had the Reverend Bobby Tilton with the Word of Faith.
Yes, can't have what's not seen until you get your eyes over what is seen. You can't see what's not seen until you let go of what is seen. And I'm talking about your money.
Oh, the money I could make if I could just shed my conscience and make believe as they do, pretending to know things no one even can know and asserting baseless speculation as though it were a matter of fact. If it didn't bother me to mislead and deceive people like that, I could be a multimillionaire right now. Curse this sense of ethics keeping me honest. And today I'm talking about, or rather to, Pastor Robert Morris, another Dallas area megachurch pastor estimated to be worth as much as $50 million. His Gateway Church boasts a congregation of around 30,000 members, and it takes in well over $100 million a year, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in a single year. And that surprises me, because someone sent me this video of one of his sermons, and every single point he tries to make therein is so wrong that I have to address and correct it, if only for the sake of truth and for the common good. And for those of you watching from Europe or Australia, remember the alarming fact that while there may be only 1 in 5 people like him where you are, he is like every other person where I live. And people like him own and control practically everything, ruling every level of state and federal government, from the highest office and the courts right down to the local city councils and school boards. That explains so much of what's gone wrong with America, doesn't it? So strap in, we're going for a ride.
How do I know there is a God?
You don't, and not just because I know there isn't one.
So I'm not at all trying to cram something down your throat. I'm just telling you how I know that there's a God, okay? So here's, I've arranged the talk in 3 points to maybe help us to remember them, okay? So here's number 1. There is a correct worldview. There is a correct worldview. Now, if you don't know what a worldview is, it's how you see the world, how you see life, and your worldview should help you with some questions that help you through this life. It brings comfort to you as a person, to your thinking process, and to your soul. And let me just explain. There's actually only one correct worldview when you define a worldview correctly, and that is Christianity.
No. The word correct is defined as free from error in accordance with fact or truth. None of that applies to Christianity, which is divided into tens of thousands of often violently conflicting denominations due to differences in interpretation and speculation. So it's definitely not free from error, and I would argue that it is entirely erroneous, because there's no truth to it, meaning there's nothing you can show to be true about it. The truth is what the facts are, and you don't have either one. Yet you're supposed to believe it anyway, without question, reservation, or reason, because it's a faith-based belief system with required beliefs and prohibited beliefs, where free thought, one of the most basic of all human rights, is denied by religion and criminalized as damnable heresy or apostasy. Faith is not a reliable path to truth at all, but it's a great way to stay wrong forever, being fooled by lies and never knowing any better, which is what faith is all about. Consequently, any belief that requires faith should be rejected for that reason. But I accept that my position of science-minded rational skepticism combined with secular humanism counts as a worldview by your definition, and my worldview is demonstrably correct, being the only one in accordance with facts and truth, where your worldview is not remotely. So there is a correct worldview, but it's mine and definitely not yours.
Now, again, I'm just sharing with you some things for you to think about. Maybe you never thought about it. But a worldview, a correct worldview, must address 4 issues. And let me tell you what the 4 issues are, okay? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. If you're going to have a worldview that helps the way you think and helps your soul to be at ease It needs to address origin, meaning, morality, and destiny.
Well, I don't have a soul, and neither do you, so that's irrelevant.
Now let me give you some questions so you remember these, all right? Origin would be, how did I get here? How did I get here? Every human wants to know that.
I just finished a 50-episode educational video series explaining human evolution in detail, and it's simple enough even for high schoolers to understand. I'll put the link to that playlist below.
Meaning would be, why am I here? Why am I on this earth? Why am I here?
Asking why is a fallacious question because it presupposes an intended purpose when there evidently isn't one, nor could there be. Now, things happen because of cause and effect, of often complicated processes, but not because of an invisible man pulling levers behind a curtain.
Morality would be, how do I define good and evil? How do I define good and evil? That's morality.
While I would argue that morality is not a necessary aspect of one's worldview, I do happen to have what I think is a fairly objective moral standard to determine that. And I've never heard a Christian define what morality even is, much less how we should know what is or is not moral. They say they have an objective moral standard, but it always turns out to be the subjective opinion of whoever is pretending to speak for or interpret their God's subjective opinion.
And destiny is what happens to me after death.
When you or I die, our thoughts and memories, our dreams and interests, our talents and aptitudes, everything that was once us will be reduced to a few dozen pounds of ape meat going bad. The only advantage you have over me is that when your brain shuts off forever, just like when you go under general anesthesia for surgery, your consciousness will blink out of existence permanently before you even have the opportunity to be disappointed. But that's how it should be. I've never heard any description of a posthumous eternity, even in heaven, that didn't sound like an insufferable damnation with no hope of escape. And some Christians say, well, no, we'll be happy all the time, and we wouldn't have desires or ambitions anymore, because you wouldn't be you anymore. So there's no point in going on. If all that was really real, which it thankfully isn't, then in your first gazillion years, you'd already be pleading for some way to just let it end. And Christians talk an awful lot about hell, but they don't discuss heaven very much, because it doesn't take very long to realize that your impossible promise of a posthumous paradise is just another Hotel California. Thanks, but no thanks. Frankly, I'd rather just die and stay dead completely. And I even said so in a prayer when I still believed in God at 12 years old.
Now think about it. Every human wants to know these four things. How did I get here? Why am I here? How do I define good and evil? And what happens to me after death? Okay, there's only one worldview that answers it. No other worldview does.
Absolutely wrong. And first of all, Christianity doesn't actually answer any of these questions. It only provides baseless speculation according to fairy tales that we know for certain did not really happen. Yet we're expected to believe it anyway and take it on faith just because you say so. No. Wrong answers are not answers at all. And we can't say that any of these excuses actually count as answers until we can show the truth of it and show that they are. But secondly, we can't show the truth of it because there isn't any. All religious beliefs fall into one of two categories, not evidently true and evidently not true. And most religious beliefs are based on frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies, and that includes this entire sermon that you're giving here. Accuracy and accountability are paramount in my worldview, where they don't even matter at all in yours. And third, Christianity isn't the only worldview that pretends to answer these questions. Every religion makes that claim, and not just the Abrahamic faiths like Judaism, Islam, and Baha'i, all of which you simply ignored because they refute your point. Zoroastrianism answers each of these questions too, or it claims to, just like Christianity does, and so does Sikhism. Hinduism probably gives the best and most comprehensive answers because they're the oldest religion in continuous practice, so they've had the most practice. And they have the biggest volume of religion in that the Bhagavad Gita is but one chapter of the Mahabharata, the world's largest epic poem, and that's just one book out of a whole library of sacred scriptures dedicated to the Hindu pantheon. So no, Christianity is not the only worldview that answers these questions. In fact, it doesn't answer any of them at all.
Evolution does not answer these four. It doesn't tell us what happens after death. It doesn't tell us why we're here.
That's because evolution isn't a worldview. Christianity is because it's a religion, and all religions count as worldviews. We could also say that materialism or philosophical naturalism is a worldview too, and that's the contrast you should have alluded to. I wrote a book on the foundational falsehoods of creationism. I'll put a link to that too. The very first of those falsehoods is the idea that one must either reject God to accept some scientific facts like evolution, or that one must reject evident realities in order to believe in the Bible, as if the Bible is God. That's binary thinking, and it's wrong. I remember when the global statistics were that most evolutionists are Christian and most Christians are evolutionists. And since then, religions in general and Christianity in particular have been in steep decline in every single state and around the world, while atheism and religious extremism have both been on the rise following recent trends toward dangerous polarization. But it is still the case that many of the pioneers of evolutionary theory and even some of its important champions have been and still are Christians with advanced degrees and expertise in science. They understand evolution and science better than you never will, and they know that they don't have two conflicting worldviews because evolution is not a worldview.
And even how did I get here? Just think about it. Most people have never even thought of this. Do you realize that evolution is still referred to in science books, listen, as the theory of evolution?
Have you ever heard of the theory of gravity or relativity? How about atomic theory, cell theory, or the germ theory of disease? A theory is not a wild guess of baseless speculation like religion is. Every modern scientific theory is both a fact and a body of knowledge or field of study enveloping all available data, including all related hypotheses and even natural laws to explain that basic fact.
And most people don't even know how long it's been a theory. Would you like to know? 161 years. It's the longest theory that science has ever had.
Nope. In 1783, Antoine Laurent Lavoisier began the chemical revolution when he disproved phlogiston theory and proposed his own theory of oxygen in its stead. So the existence of the oxygen you're breathing now has been a scientific theory for 237 years. And atomic theory, first proposed by Democritus in ancient Greece, was already a theory before theories were ever defined, and it's still a theory even after Hiroshima. You see, science has a rule that no hypothesis can ever be proven. They can be disproved, but they can never be proved in the positive sense, because that would close our minds to the possibility of further improvement. And the goal of science is to improve understanding of the natural world. That means that we have to seek out the flaws in our current perspective and correct them. You can't do that if you can't admit that some flaws might still exist. So when a given hypothesis is shown to have profound explanative power, and it already has withstood a sustained and substantial battery of critical analysis for some time, where new evidence and experiments always only ever lend further support without any contradiction, then that hypothesis has been effectively proven by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. But we don't say that it's proven. Instead, that hypothesis is elevated to theory, the highest level of confidence that science can achieve. That's what happened with evolution, which has withstood and weathered more and harsher scrutiny than any other aspect of science, and is now better supported than even the theory of gravity.
Theory. It's a theory. It began, again, many people don't know this, and yet they say they believe it. It began when Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species in 1859.
Actually, no. Evolution was first proposed by the Greek philosopher Anaximander in the 6th century before the Gregorian calendar that we're currently using. Other people, from Aristotle to Lamarck, had tried to understand it, but Darwin was the first to discover testable mechanisms, natural and sexual selection, to explain how it works. In the decades since then, we've identified several more mechanisms, such as endosymbiosis, epigenetics, and genetic drift, which is actually more fundamental than natural selection.
In that book, he uses 2 entire chapters to doubt his own theory. 2 chapters.
Because proposing a scientific theory is exactly opposite of a religious belief. You don't get to just make up whatever you want and tell people to believe it like you can in religion. In science, you have to demonstrate that there is at least some truth to what you're saying, regardless whether we want to believe it or not. So it doesn't matter if we have faith. I mean, the reality neither requires nor desires faith. Because unlike religion, science doesn't want to be fooled into believing things that are neither evidently nor even possibly true. So we have to find a way to disprove our hypotheses rather than encourage belief in them. And when you fail to do that, and no one else can disprove it either, and there's still a demonstrable probability that it's at least partially true, and it's useful in that it certainly explains a lot of it is true, then it becomes a theory.
One of them, he talks about the human eye. And he said, just thinking about the human eye would disprove my theory when you think about how complex the human eye is.
No, he didn't say that. What he actually said was that it only seems absurd at first. Then he spent the next few pages going over the considerable evidence that he already knew about way back when, and of course we have accumulated much more evidence than that now.
But he also makes a statement similar to this. He says, if solid scientific evidence does not come forth in a reasonable amount of time to prove this theory, then it disproves this theory.
No, he didn't say that either. He did list a few ways that his theory could potentially be disproved, and he made specific predictions about exactly what evidence we should expect to find if and only if his theory is true. And one of those predictions was that he noticed that the bones in a bird's wing looked like the fingers of dinosaurs that had been fused together. So he predicted that if birds had in fact evolved from dinosaurs, then we should find a fossil bird with unfused wing fingers. Just 2 years later, some German geologists found exactly that. So Darwin's theory had already been vindicated while he was still alive with the discovery of one of the most important transitional species ever found. And of course, we found hundreds of other intermediate forms in various lineages since then.
Okay, it's been 161 years. And there is now look it up for yourself. Don't just listen to someone else. There is no evidence, none. Listen to what I'm going to say before you discount the sentence. Listen to the end of the sentence. There is no evidence that one species has ever mutated to another species. Never.
Before you make these confident pronouncements on matters you've obviously never studied, you should at least consult a scientist, preferably someone who works in one of the fields relevant to evolution. Speciation, one species mutating into another, has been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field. The first time this happened under direct observation was a years-long experiment performed by an Orthodox Christian, who then published a paper titled, "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in Light of Evolution." So even if you had only talked to Christians trained in science, you should still have known better than what you just said. But it seems you didn't even consult other creationists, because Ken Ham, the CEO of Answers in Genesis Ministries, accepts that speciation happens. Even the crackpot charlatan Kent Hovind accepts that speciation happens. So you should be a little embarrassed that you're standing up there telling tens of thousands of people that it never happened, even when the religious extremists who think the earth is only 6,000 years old know better than you do about that.
It's what we still call this day the missing link.
No, you're getting different concepts confused now. We're not talking about speciation anymore. The missing link referred to another of Darwin's specific predictions when he said that if and only if his theory was true, then we should find a transitional species, a link in what was then described as an evolutionary chain, intermediate between humans and the generalized apes as they were known in his day.
It's still missing. 161 years later, with all of our scientific knowledge, and we can't find this one bone, this one fossil that shows one species mutating to another.
The missing link between humans and apes that Darwin predicted and carefully described was discovered nearly a half a century ago, way back in 1974. Since then, hundreds more individuals have been found just from that one species, in addition to several other intermediate links dating to before and after that one. So where you said we've never found even one bone, we've actually found the bones and skeletons of thousands of individuals.
Now, within a species, we evolve. We change. I'm a human. You probably will not believe what I'm about to tell you until you think about it for a moment. But I want you to look at my size, okay? I used to be 20 inches long. I'm telling you the truth, 20 inches. And I used to weigh about 8 pounds. Now I'm 6'2", and I weigh some pounds. I'm sorry if that didn't come out, the exact number, but I'm not gonna say it again. All right, so the point is I have changed. That's all the word evolve means. I have evolved.
Seriously? I'll include a link to Berkeley University's introductory primer, Evolution 101, because you don't know what evolution is. It's not just any old change over time. Evolutionary theory refers specifically to variable allele frequencies in reproductive populations over many generations. Understanding how species evolve is analogous to how languages evolve, how Spanish, French, and Italian evolved from Latin, for example, with the accumulation of subtle changes in each group building up over centuries. Changes in whole populations over many generations, not the biological development of any single individual.
But no species has ever evolved from one species to another. Never.
Yes, they have. And we have lots of ways of proving that now. I can even prove that to your satisfaction if you're interested, though that would require some education. In the meantime, I'll include a link below to the National Academy of Sciences listing various types of evidence that you didn't know about from independent fields of study that actually do support evolution.
Here's what evolution tells us too. We are time, matter, and chance. Time, matter, and chance. In other words, we are only metaphysical. We don't know what happens after death. We're only metaphysical. Here's the problem with that.
There's a few problems with that, actually. One is that evolution doesn't say that. Two is that you don't know what any of the words you're using actually mean. For example, chance isn't a thing. Instead, we're talking about emergent properties of deterministic processes. Evolution also does not say that we are metaphysical. What I think you meant to say is that we are only physical, although evolution doesn't say that either. Evolution is just an explanation of population genetics, the process by which artificial selection has produced different breeds of dogs and natural selection has produced different species of dogs. We're talking about the mechanisms we've been manipulating throughout the entire history of agriculture and have only recently begun to understand.
If you're only matter, then why do you react when you hear that someone passed away from COVID-19? No, why do you feel sad? Because you're not just matter, you're a soul. You have a soul, you have feelings, you have emotions, you have thoughts. You're a person, you have a soul.
Pity that you don't know what a soul is either. Why is it that I have to know both sides of this argument better than believers know their own alone? You've got the soul confused with consciousness, but they're not the same thing. Try to understand that only about a third of scientists in the United States still believe in God. And now think about the fact that a significant percentage, half or most neuroscientists, don't believe we have a soul. But of course they have some understanding of how the physical brain produces consciousness. Even the few neuroscientists who do believe in God still understand that physical trauma or drugs can manipulate and even permanently alter our personalities, proving that our personalities are physical too. So even if we are only matter without a literal ghost in the machine, such as you imagine, you still would be a person with feelings, with or without a soul. And we don't have a soul, by the way. I can go into more detail about that later, but this video is already too long.
Another thing that's difficult is morality. How do I define good and evil?
I like to use an objective standard that was eloquently summarized by fellow activist Scott Clifton.
Here's what I understand the terms morally right and morally wrong to mean. A particular action or choice is moral or right when it somehow promotes happiness, well-being, or health, or it somehow minimizes unnecessary harm or suffering, or it does both. A particular action or choice is immoral or wrong when it somehow diminishes happiness, well-being, or health, or it somehow causes unnecessary harm or suffering, or again, it does both.
I think everyone in the world agrees with this basic definition, and we can use that to show that the God of the Bible is often objectively immoral.
Many people say, well, morality is subjective. In other words, each person decides what's right for him or her. That's horrible. That is horrible. And many Christians will even, they've been sucked in by this. They say, well, each person should decide what's right for him or her. No, I can disprove that in an instant with one question. Do you lock your doors at night? You know why? Because you're afraid of subjective morality. In other words, someone might not believe it's wrong to enter your home and shoot you.
No. If someone enters your house and shoots you, they know it's immoral, but they're likely desperate, acting on impulses that override their morality. The funny thing about Christianity, though, is that your personal God that lives in your head hates all the same things that you do for the same reasons that you do. And your God in your head always understands and accepts whatever excuses you use to justify whatever it was that you did. That's why your personal God always forgives you, even when you snuck into that guy's house and shot him, because you had to. Yeah, I know.
And it is wrong. Murder is always wrong. Always. Always.
It's interesting that you say that in Texas, one of dwindling few states that still has the death penalty, and which has executed more than 5 times as many prisoners than the next most lethal state just in the last decade. And this is condoned by the Bible, which commands execution for all manner of crimes and even non-crimes, such as working on weekends or being the victim of rape. So I have to wonder, how do you define what is right and wrong, since your Bible cannot help you with that? Have you noticed that the only kind of killing the Bible doesn't condone is when it's done out of mercy? Like when assisted suicide is requested by a terminally ill patient as the only way to preserve their dignity and spare them and their family inevitable but avoidable physical, emotional, and financial torment. Or when an abortion is necessary to save the life of a mother. Tough choices have to be made sometimes. Whereas your Bible says that you can perform an abortion in Numbers 5 simply to tell whether your wife has been unfaithful. That's hardly moral, isn't it? So your always, always, always isn't always.
So you have to understand there is a correct worldview, okay? So that's point 1. So here's point 2. Now, before I give it to you, let me say this.
No, next time. I can only correct so many errors in one video, and your half hour is about up.
Okay, there's more. This is a 3-parter. So this is the end of part number 1. I'll just let the credits run for a little while longer. Let's see, there's 30 seconds left. We'll let it run and get the sound on again. Next one.
Recently, Dallas megachurch pastor Robert Morris said in one of his sermons,
I know there is a God.
So this is the second episode of a 3-part series wherein I show him that he doesn't know that, nor anything else he professed to know in that sermon.
So you have to understand there is a correct worldview, okay?
In the previous episode, we talked about how the scientific and humanist perspective is the correct worldview, and definitely not that of Christianity, nor of any other religion either.
So that's point 1. So here's point 2. Now, before I give it to you, let me say this. Atheism, by definition, I'll explain it to you in a moment, makes the statement, there is no God. Those 4 words, there is no God. Okay?
No, that's incorrect.
So just hang on, just stay with me, okay? Here's my point 2, okay? There is no atheist. It is scientifically impossible to be an atheist. And I can prove it to you. And even if you might have a different opinion, you probably will still have no answer for this. I promise you. Because I'm going to use science, okay?
No, you're going to break your promise, and you're not going to use science. You don't know how to use science, and you wouldn't if you could.
The word science means knowledge. That's what it means. The definition of science, I actually wrote it down from Webster's dictionary, is knowledge about or study of the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observation. So, in other words, the only way, if it's science, you have done a study and you have based your knowledge on facts and experiments, okay?
When we're talking about the natural world, yes, but you're talking about the supernatural. Now, science cannot even address that because there's no evidence of it, though you believe it anyway, just because you want to, and there's no way to test it because there's no way to falsify it that the mystics would accept, because you have to believe it regardless, or be damned if you don't, or so you say, though there's no reason to believe you when you say that.
So let's talk about this no God. That is what the word atheist means.
No, it isn't. If you Google atheism, you'll see that it is a disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. This is the common usage. And notice that Google also defines disbelief as an inability or refusal to accept that something is true or real, and not necessarily belief that it is false. You can look this up almost anywhere and you'll find the same definition, even though most dictionaries were written by Christians. Of course, atheists understand their own position better than you do. American Atheist, for example, says that atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods, and not necessarily a belief that no gods exist. Although those who believe there is no God are a subset of those who lack belief in God. Neither one has a belief in any God. And likewise, Atheist Alliance International also defines atheism as being without belief in a God or gods, or the lack of belief in a God or gods. So that's what atheism really means.
Now, let me just say, they've changed the definition now. They've changed it because they realize that it's impossible to be an atheist.
No. If you look up atheism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's about the only site that defines atheism the way you do. But it's wrong, because it's based on the faulty assumption that if atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theism is the proposition that God exists and not the psychological condition of believing that there's a God, then it follows that atheism is not the absence of the psychological condition of believing that God exists. However, as I've already shown, the consistent, common, standard definition cited by every one of the self-identifying atheist organizations is that theism is the psychological condition of believing that a God exists, and theistic believers agree with it too. Even your own statement of faith supports this. Thus, atheism is the absence of the psychological condition of believing that any gods exist. Theism is it's not necessarily a rejection of the proposition, but rather a rejection of belief in the proposition. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy admits this, saying that it is important to recognize that the term atheism is polysemous, i.e., it has more than one related meaning, even within philosophy. Thus, weak atheism, as a lack of belief, is certainly a legitimate definition in the sense that it reports how a significant number of people use the term. A significant number of people being a consensus of how virtually all atheists self-identify.
Again, look at the original word. Atheism or athe, theos, theo comes from the Greek word God. A is an antonym, which means opposite or not or no. The word literally means no God. No God. That's what it means.
No, the A means without, so atheist means without gods or godless. Theism is a God belief, so without theism means without God belief. Thus, atheists are without a God belief. Theists have a God belief, atheists do not. It all comes down to this one question. Do you believe in a God? Yes equals theist, no equals atheist. It really is that simple. Look at your own mythology. When you die, you're supposed to go before St. Peter at the pearly gates, and he asks one question. Did you believe in God? Because remember, it doesn't matter how evil you were. All sins may be forgiven if you but believe. But if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you were, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. And we're told to believe this on faith, according to an assumption of authority rather than indicative evidence, and maybe even in spite of evidence to the contrary. So gullibility is the sole criteria for redemption. St. Peter does not ask whether you know there is a God. No one even can know that, so you don't know it either. Instead, the pearly gatekeeper is supposed to ask whether you believed there was a God. Yes means possible forgiveness and a stairway to heaven. No means a fate worse than death down the highway to hell. If you're an innocent, agnostic, non-theist, doesn't matter. You're all going to hell in the same handbasket. So, whether we're standing at the pearly gates or before a theocratic magistrate, the question before us was never, is there a God? The question imposed upon us throughout history and theology is, and always was, do you believe in a God? Whoever or whatever collective cannot answer yes to that question is atheist. They do not have the psychological condition of believing that a God exists.
So you can't go changing the definition now, or you could create a new word.
Creating new words is part of the reason you're confused. In 1869, Darwin's bulldog Thomas Huxley invented the word agnostic, apparently because he was annoyed at some atheists in his day claiming that having just discovered all this evidence of evolution disproved the Bible and consequently disproved God. He thought that was too simple to be a fair assessment because not everyone is a biblical literalist. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So rather than counter them the way he should have, he tried to distance himself from him by wearing a different label. So he made up a word that meant exactly the same thing that atheism already did, not believing in a God. But he added that agnosticism also meant not believing there's not a God. This caused some people to think that atheism must have meant having a positive belief that there is no God. However, Webster's 1828 dictionary already defined atheism as the disbelief of the existence of God, and it defined disbelief as refusal of credit or faith, denial of belief, not denial of the claim, but denial of belief in the claim. So the common definition of atheism 40 years before Huxley's attempted redefinition was already the same one that we're still using a century and a half after that too.
If you want to come up with a new word to say, I don't believe there's a God, then come up with a new word.
But I'm using the original and still consistent common meaning that never changed. The contrast is and always was between those who believe and those who don't believe. Now, within atheism, there are those who think that a God may be possible, but that there isn't enough evidence to convince them of that, so they lack belief. I was like that myself for decades. But now I am one of the anti-theists who realize that God is not even possible and that there is overwhelming evidence that your God is an entirely fictional character like Superman or Pecos Bill, since I'm talking to a fellow Texan. But regardless whether they lack a belief in God or whether they have a belief that there is no God, they still answer St. Peter's question the exact same way. No, we don't believe in a God.
But if you want to use the word atheist, scientifically there's no atheist because you can't definitively say there is no God, and I'll prove it to you.
Yes, we can, at least if we're talking about the Bible God, especially from the perspective of a biblical literalist. Now, I know that your statement of faith says that the Bible is the absolutely infallible authority and that nothing can ever be added to it in any regard. That's what it says in Deuteronomy, twice, before a bunch of other books were added to the Hebrew Bible. It says it again in Revelations, which is one of several more books that were added later on by other authors of a different religion. Your statement of faith also says that no one can subtract from the Bible either, except for all these books that your Bible refers to, but that were removed by the fallible human authors and editors sorting and assembling this haphazard compilation of fables and folklore. I mean, why would God's Word refer to these other books that were written by mere fallible people? Unless they were all written by people, which of course they were, just like the Vedic scriptures, the Adi Granth of the Sikhs, the Avestas of Zarathustra, the Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'u'llah, and a host of other man-made myths claiming to be the absolute truth and the revealed word of the one true God. Since you are a biblical literalist, that means this is your God. Because you think that if the Bible is wrong, then God is wrong, because you can't distinguish doctrine from deity. So you think that disproving any of the tall tales in your favorite book of bedtime stories disproves your God right along with it. And of course, there are so many of these fables that we know for absolutely certain did not really happen and are not true. For example, back in 2001, Senior Rabbi David Wolpe said that the truth is that virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. He said that to his own Jewish congregation in a sermon on Passover. So you know it was an important admission. And it's not just a consensus among archaeologists. In the years since then, a growing number of historians have given up on the idea of a historical Moses. That character was evidently based on at least a handful of other people. Dr. Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian, but he's also an award-winning scientist, and he was the director of the Human Genome Project. He says that, unfortunately, the concepts of Adam and Eve as the literal first couple and the ancestors of all humans simply do not fit the evidence. Though we already knew that the myth of Adam and Eve was adopted and adapted from previously pagan mythology and rewritten as a parable that was meant to be interpreted metaphorically. It's not real. It's only symbolic. Talking snakes and magic trees should have given you your first clue. Well, after the tale of Adam being created by a golem spell, and after comparing the conflicting descriptions of creation between the first and second chapters of Genesis. And that's before we get to all of the other absurdities, atrocities, inconsistencies, contradictions, and failed prophecies strewn throughout this whole collection of man-made mythology. And we know that none of the most cited stories in this book ever really happened. The Tower of Babel obviously didn't happen, and God never wrestled with Jacob, and there was never a guy who lived 3 days inside a fish or a whale. The people who wrote the Bible didn't know there was a difference. And I made a video series showing how meteorology, geology, paleontology, dendrochronology, zoology, anthropology, archaeology, and even mythology all disproved Noah's flood absolutely and conclusively. I'll include a link to that playlist below.
In order for you to say that something exists, you have to have done a study, you have to have the facts to back it up.
That's true. Positive claims require positive evidence. Absolutely, yes. You have to be able to show that there's at least some objectively verifiable data just to know whether there is any potential truth to what you're saying. The burden of proof is always on the one making the positive claim. Otherwise, it's just baseless speculation, not even worthy of discussion. Yet, here you are pretending to know that there is a God when you don't have any facts and evidence to back that up. Before we can say whether something is even possible, there must be some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating whether such a possibility actually exists. We don't have that for your God, which means there is literally not even a possibility that your God exists.
But in order to say something doesn't exist, you'd have to have all knowledge. You'd have to know everything to say that this doesn't exist. You have to know everything.
Wrong again, as always. Science is only concerned with what is supported by evidence. Whatever is not supported doesn't warrant serious consideration. You have to have the evidence to back the claim before you make it, just like you said a moment ago. Because if you don't have that evidence, then your claim is invalid. Understand that an unsupported assertion has no more credence than a claim that has already been proven false. And if you're inclined to make unsupported assertions, you will immediately lose all credibility. In any other practice, that would be called lying. Only in religion are out-and-out lies rebranded as a revelation of absolute truth. It's like when you make up your own statistics, saying that 50% of the people are like this, or 99.9% of the time it's like that. If you don't have any source to show where you got the data to back that up, and yet you're stating it as a fact, here in Texas, as you know, we call that talking out of your ass. That's what all your claims about absolute truth amount to, just lies. So I don't have to say that your God doesn't exist, except in reply to your empty assertion that he does, until you can show the facts to back that up.
Let me give you an example. If you said to me, there is no city called Paris, Texas, I would say to you, show me your study. Show me how you came to that knowledge, what facts you based that on, what experiments you'd had. Otherwise, it's not scientific, it's just your opinion.
Remember that you just said that, because those words are going to come back to bite you.
If you say there is no Paris, Texas, then I'd say, have you been to every city in Texas? And if you haven't been to every city in Texas or studied every city, then you can't definitively say there is no city named Paris, Texas.
No one would say that they'd studied every city, nor would they know if they had, even if they thought they did. You could have missed one and not noticed. And likewise, you can't say there's no Darth Vader. It doesn't matter that you know who wrote the screenplay for Star Wars and what it was based on, that all those books and movies are all sensationalized fiction, just like your Bible is. You still can't prove there's no Darth Vader because, by your logic, you'd have to have searched every planet around every star and all the space between the stars in every galaxy far, far away, and you would have to have already done that a long time ago. So you can't absolutely prove that there is no Darth Vader, but neither can you say that there is one and expect anyone to take you seriously until you have the evidence to back that claim.
I can say there is, by the way, because I've been there. And by the way, it's nothing like Paris, France. But it's a nice city. If you're watching from Paris, Texas, hey, it's a nice city. I grew up in East Texas, so I know there's a Paris, Texas, because we beat them in football. Just wanted you to know we beat them in football. So, but there is a Paris, Texas. But you can't say there's not a Paris, Texas, unless you've done a study and you have facts and you've been to or you've studied every city in Texas. You see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, just 5 minutes before you said this, you also said,
there is no. Now look it up for yourself. Don't just listen to someone else. There is no evidence, none. Listen what I'm going to say before you discount the sentence. Listen to the end of the sentence. There is no evidence that one species has ever mutated to another species. Never.
how could you know that there's no evidence? Do you know everything? Obviously not. You have no facts. You're just asserting alternative facts to support your alternative reality. Have you done any study of this at all? Obviously not. And you've done no experiments either, because just 10 seconds on Google Scholar would have provided literally tons of evidence had you only bothered to look. So it's not scientific, it's only your opinion, stated as if it were a fact, which makes it a lie. You also said,
no species has ever evolved from one species to another. Never.
have you watched every individual in every generation of every species, everywhere around the world and in the oceans too, over all the eons that life has existed on this planet? Or are you still talking out of your ass and ignoring all the volumes of evidence available just a few keystrokes away?
So in the very same way, you can't say there is no God if you don't have all knowledge.
We don't have to disprove a negative that was never indicated in the first place. Just as it is true that positive claims require positive evidence, Hitchens' razor says that what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence, because we have no reason to believe you. You have to at least show that there's a there, or we have nothing to talk about.
Now let me explain that, okay? How much of all knowledge does the smartest person in the world have? All knowledge. All knowledge. All history of every culture that exists now and has ever existed. How much do you know? Just if you're the smartest person. How much do you know of all history of every culture? How much of all mathematics do you know? All algebra, all geometry, all calculus, all mathematics. How much do you know? How much science do you know? How much English do you know? Not just English, but how much language would be a better way to say it. Language, you know. By the way, there are over 7,000 languages in the world right now. How many can you speak fluently? And there are over 31,000 languages that have ever existed. 31,000. So how many of those languages do you know? I'm trying to figure out how much of all knowledge do you know? Do you know every vowel and every consonant of every language that's ever existed, and can you conjugate every verb in every language? Now, I realize I've lost some of you with the word conjugation. I realize that. And I know some of you are thinking, well, Pastor, my wife and I waited till after we were married to conjugate. Okay, that's a different word. Sorry, I just couldn't resist that one. Okay, that's just a joke on the word conjugation. Okay, but so how much does the smartest person in the world possess of all knowledge? Now, here's what the smart people say. Less than 1%. Less than 1%. Matter of fact, there is someone today who is called the smartest man in the world. He has the highest IQ in the world right now of anyone living. His name is Christopher Langan. And I just want to give you one statement that the smartest person in the world makes. Here, listen to this statement. This is the smartest person in the world. His IQ is higher than every person in the world. He says, you can prove the existence of God, the soul, and an afterlife using mathematics. Now, that's what the smartest person in the world says.
Then why hasn't he ever done it? Why hasn't anyone ever done it using his or any other formulae? I was going to make a video about Christopher Langan a few months ago, but I decided not to because it would be unnecessarily mean. His model failed, and he doesn't deserve any more attention. But since you brought him up, Langan is a horse rancher and a former bar bouncer in Montana who nonetheless scores very high on IQ tests for whatever that's worth. We know that the reliability or value of IQ tests is hotly debated by experts, but let's be generous and count it as objectively demonstrated that Chris Langan's IQ is roughly 195. And consequently, some journalists have called him the smartest man in America. Some academics, however, have a very different impression after reviewing his work. Langan's cognitive theoretic model of the universe claims to constitute absolute truth, providing the logical framework of a theory of everything, and he says that it will prove the existence of God mathematically. However, this model was published nearly 2 decades ago, and physicists today still don't have a working theory of everything. They can't show any truth to his model at all, much less absolute truth. And theologians around the world agree that belief in God still requires faith in absence of his mathematic proof. So Langan believes that there is a physical reality external to our minds and that other dimensions exist in addition to that. He also says that he can see these other dimensions by recognizing connections and correlated patterns. You know, the same way paranoid conspiracy theorists see patterns no one else can see. Except that Langan says he only sees these during REM sleep, which of course means that he's just dreaming this all up. As I said, I could go on, but I don't want to be mean.
But the smart people in the world say that probably the smartest person in the world might possess, they say it's less than 1%. So let's just say it's 1%. And let's say you're that person. Is it possible in the 99% of all knowledge that you do not possess, is it possible that something exists that you don't know about? Of course. You couldn't answer that question any other way. We're not talking about even probabilities, we're talking about possibilities, but the probability mathematically would be yes as well, because it's 99% probability. So is it possible in the 99% of all knowledge you don't possess, something exists? Yes, of course it is. So you can't say definitively it doesn't exist unless you have all knowledge.
It's one thing to admit that some undefined something exists that we don't know about. That's certain. But you're talking about a very specific thing. What you're doing, that all religious fundamentalists do, is you're committing the logical fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. The philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell proposed a nice illustration of the failure of the argument that you're using. He wrote that if there was a teapot, a normal everyday teapot orbiting the sun somewhere in space between Earth and Mars, it would be too small to be seen by telescopes, so you couldn't prove that it's not there. But that's no reason to believe that it is there, and there's no possibility that it could be there. So it would be absurd to even consider it unless there was evidence indicating it. If there's not, then we are perfectly justified in saying that there is no celestial teapot. And the same goes for leprechauns. Even if they were real, you could search all of Ireland and never find one, because we're told that leprechauns are invisible when they want to be. But not only do we know how people like to make up tall tales about supernatural nonsense, we also know that it is biologically impossible for humans to be that tiny or to turn invisible. A Christian preacher even told me that he knows that there's no such thing as leprechauns simply because there's no evidence of them. And I would add that another reason to know that would be that their magic is impossible by definition.
You cannot say there is no God.
Yeah, we can. There are a few things that are absolute, and we don't know anything absolutely. We don't have perfect or complete knowledge about anything. But within the bounds of reason, yeah, I know that God does not exist to the same degree and for the same reasons that I know that leprechauns don't exist.
Now, what you can say is, I don't know if there's a God. That is an agnostic. Now, we say agnostic is the way we divide the word, but the G actually goes with Gnostic. It comes from a Greek word. The G is silent. It's Gnosticism. It means knowledge. A, again, is an antonym, and it means not or I don't know. I don't know if there's a God.
Yeah, I used to be an agnostic atheist myself for about 15 years before I finally got to the point that I realized that gods, ghosts, and magic are not even possible, and that it's silly to even pretend to give such things a benefit of the doubt. So I'm an anti-theist, or a strong atheist now.
You can say, I don't know if there's a God.
You're right. I can say that you don't know there's a God, because that's a true statement. If you can't show it, you don't know it. and you shouldn't pretend that you do.
But you cannot definitively say there is no God.
Yes, I can, definitively, because God, at least your God, is defined by his miraculous nature. And miracles and magic are essentially the same thing, both being the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways that are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics. And anything that defies the laws of physics is physically impossible by definition, and thus God is impossible by extension. I can say that there's no God logically, too. If God exists beyond time and space, then there is no time and place where or when God exists. Because if God exists outside reality, then he does not exist in reality.
And if you do say it, I would think that you don't, because you don't have all knowledge, it's 99% that you don't have, even if you're the smartest person, I would say it's foolish to make a statement like that. And the Bible says the same thing. Psalm 14:1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The exact statement of atheism.
Understand that a fool is commonly understood to be one who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence. So it's no surprise that the Bible and the Quran both use the opposite definition, because the purpose of the scriptures is to fool you. That's why they both demand that you believe on faith, or else. That's why they both say that a fool is whoever does not believe impossible nonsense for no good reason. Those who were duped by any of the violently conflicting religions based on these scriptures would say that there is a God because they were fooled into believing that. But what about those who weren't so foolish as to believe such improbable claims from such a questionable source and without any evidence at all? When they know that there is no truth to the claim whatsoever, not even a possibility that it could be true, then what would they say?
There is no God.
Exactly.
And again, I'm saying if you look at the definition today, they're changing it to a person who doesn't believe in God. But the reason they've changed it is because they've realized scientifically you can't say there is no God.
Yes, we can say that there is no God if it is in response to your empty assertion that there is one, and we won't even assume the burden of proof if we do that. But we never changed the definition. Atheism was originally used as an insult. The Greek Hellenists used to call the Christians godless, without theism, and the Christians used to lob the same pejorative back at the pagans. But the very first atheist, Matthias Knudsen, the first person ever to adopt the label by choice, admitted that he was an atheist simply because he did not believe in any God. And he invented a new label to account for the fact that he also denies God as well as religious scriptures and clergy. So atheist already meant nothing more than a lack of belief in God in the very beginning, just like it still does today. And the first guy to wear the atheist label proudly was Paul Henry Thierry, also known as Baron de Holbrook. He wrote an in-depth description, defense, and praise of atheism in the broader sense of those who lack belief in God. And he distinguished atheists from those who also reject the God proposal. So he wasn't an anti-theist like me. He was only an atheist. And he said that all children are born atheists because they have no idea of God. So no. Atheism always meant unbelief, originally and primarily, rather than the claim that there is no God, which applies to only a few within that much larger category. So you've been arguing a false premise in defense of a false promise.
Even if you might have a different opinion, you probably will still have no answer for this. I promise you.
I'm actually enjoying this. Unbelievable. I'm just riveted. It's almost like it was a good thing that I had insomnia or have insomnia tonight. But I'm not saying I'm not going to be perky by the end of the next and final part of Aron Ra's presentation. So rather than wasting time, let's get to it. Right. Sorry about the wait, but you should have had time to go and get popcorn. That's what.
One of the things that has always irritated me about the claims that religious people make is when they think that really, really believing something is the same thing as knowing it. As if the power of positive thought could change reality if you could just believe hard enough. So they have to convince themselves and assert their conviction with certainty. Like when this country music singer said on Fox News,
I know there's a God.
Right.
I know for a fact
And
there's
Ellen,
a God.
I'd like to make
but it's not a fact. A fact is a point of objectively verifiable data, and you can't demonstrate that. So you don't really know it either, because knowledge is testable and demonstrable. You can show what you know. But if you can't confirm the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you cannot actually know what you merely believe. So when one of our local Dallas megachurch pastors said,
I know there is a God.
I just had to say something to correct him.
So that's point number 2. Here's point number 3. There is a God. There is a God.
Oh, I see. You know there's a God because there's a God, and you know that because you know there's a God. Well, that is logically fallacious. I mean, your first point was your misunderstanding of science, and your second point was misrepresenting the atheist position. Now your third point is simply assuming your own original premise? That's called question begging, a logical fallacy wherein your argument is invalid because of one or more flaws in reasoning, which you have consistently demonstrated throughout your entire sermon.
Now you have to remember that I'm telling you how I know there's a God, okay? So this is how I know.
If I show you what I know, the result is that you'll know it too. But if you show me what you know, it'll turn out that you didn't really know it either. This is the 3rd episode we've done on this topic, and so far you haven't given any reason yet to believe in a God, much less any justification for your claim to know that there is one. I mean, you said that...
I'm going to use science.
And that...
In order for you to say that something exists, you have to have done a study, you have to have the facts to back it up.
So what are the facts and evidence that justify your claim? How do you know what no one even can know, and therefore can only believe on faith?
Now, you might take what I just said, you might take the argument that I just used, and hopefully it wasn't argumentative, but you might take the argument that I just used and say, well, okay, Pastor, I'm going to turn it around on you. You told me that I couldn't say there is no God because I don't have all knowledge. So I'd like to say to you, how can you say there is a God and you don't have all knowledge either? And you're right, I don't even have less than 1%. I'm like at 0.0000000000001. Okay, I understand that. Okay, but it's a great question. It is a great question. Again, let me repeat the question. You might say, Pastor, you told me that I couldn't say there is no God because I don't have all knowledge. How can you say there is a God? Okay, so let me take my illustration of a place, which is Paris, Texas, and use another noun, a person, okay? So a person, let me just use a person, okay? What if I said this? There is a person named Thomas Miller.
Well, that's hardly an extraordinary claim. I mean, a quick search on Facebook returned more Thomas Millers than I care to count. However, I found only one Facebook for God. It's a public figure page, not his own personal timeline, and someone else was running it, which is how it always is with God. And we're supposed to believe that God is all-powerful, yet he always needs people to do his work for him. He can allegedly create planets and dinosaurs and anything humans can't make, but he can't make anything humans can make. He can't make a box, or a boat, or a building. He can't even write his own book. Isn't it funny that a ghost needs a ghost writer? Someone else far less competent or capable always has to do all of God's work for him, as if he can't really do anything himself, as if he was never really there.
Okay, now Pastor Thomas is seated right here on the front row. Say hi to everybody there. There's Pastor Thomas. You can see Pastor Thomas and Debbie came to hear me today, so it's very sweet of them in a 4,000-seat sanctuary. It's kind of like when I started preaching at the Highway 80 Rescue Mission.
Positive claims require positive evidence. You said there was a Thomas Miller, and you presented the evidence to back that claim. There's Thomas Miller. Very good. Now, can you do that with your God? There's Jesus right there in the front row. Say hi to everybody. You can all see that Rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef came in to see us today, or so that we could see him. I mean, I hear that nothing is impossible for your God, that he can break all the laws of physics at once just because you asked him to in a prayer. If you really believe that he can do absolutely anything, then have him say hi, like Pastor Thomas did. Why can't your God do what any normal person who really exists can do?
Anyway, all right. But here's the point. What if you said to me, there is no person named Thomas Miller?
We were supposed to be talking about your God of creation and your assertion that all the experts in anything are wrong about everything and that you know better than all of them, even though you know nothing by your own admission. And you're putting that highly controversial and extraordinary claim in the same category as the trivial coincidence that someone with a common first name also has a common surname?
What if you told me that?
Fine. If I said something that stupid, then I would have made a negative claim that I can't prove. But because it's also an absolute statement, you could disprove it with but one exception, provided you actually have the evidence that we're still waiting for.
I would say to you, well, have you met every person in the world? Doesn't that make sense?
No, science does not assert that this or that does not exist. Instead, we adhere to the null hypothesis, meaning that unsupported assertions are not considered valid. We're not going to believe you just because you say so. You need evidence to show whether something is possible, much less probable. For example, if a faith healer says that he can expel demons or cure some disease just by kicking you in the crotch, provided you give him a $1,000 vow of faith first, or if someone with the mind of a child says that obstetricians don't know what they're talking about because they're all part of the conspiracy that wants to teach sexual reproduction in school against God's will, all while suppressing stork theory, then you'll have a good idea what it's like when creationists try to argue against evolution. Or perhaps if someone who draws cartoons for a living says that the well-supported theory of plate tectonics is bunk and that the Earth is actually growing inexplicably, or maybe that it's flat and that the whole universe orbits around us, we would not give any of these ideas credence until they earned it. We don't have to disprove something that hasn't even been substantiated, especially when there is already evidence against it. The truth is what the facts are. If you can't show me the truth of it, then you can't honestly say whether there is any truth to it. If there is no evidence of Thomas Miller, then that's what we'd say, that his existence is an empty assertion, unsupported by anything. Come back when you have something to show. Until then, we have nothing to talk about because it is nothing until you show me something. But you have not earned the benefit of the doubt if you can't provide sufficient reason to believe that there is even a possibility to consider. Your inability to use logic or to understand science, philosophy, the atheist position, or even your own scripture does not count as evidence for yours or any God.
How can you tell me there is no Thomas Miller unless you've met every person in the world? You can't. But I can tell you that there is a Thomas Miller because I've met him, I talk with him, and he's my friend.
No, those are just additional assertions of subjective impressions. You can say that there is a Thomas Miller because you have demonstrable evidence to validate that claim. There's Thomas Miller sitting in the front row. Now, where is Jesus? Is there any fact that indicates your Jesus or his alleged father, the God of Abraham, who is still worshipped by the Jews and Muslims? They're the ones who still keep that very first commandment that you Christians are breaking. Is there evidence of this God or of any God from any religion or anything supernatural at all? Can you produce any fact indicating that these gods and ghosts you believe in currently exist anywhere outside of human imagination?
Now listen to me carefully. And I can tell you that there is a God because I've met him.
No, you haven't.
I talk with him.
No, you don't.
And he's my friend.
No, he isn't.
See, I don't have to have met everyone in the world to tell you Thomas Miller exists. I just have to have met Thomas Miller.
Having a magic imaginary friend is not like having a real friend. When you talk to Pastor Thomas, he can disagree with you, and he can teach you things you didn't already know. Your God can't do either of these things, because when you talk to God, you're only talking to yourself. When other people talk to your God, they get different answers that contradict the answers that you get. None of you can ever learn any new information that you could not have already known, because your God doesn't know any more than you do. Nor can your God have corrected any of the many errors you've already committed in this sermon before you shared it to 30,000 some odd people, because your God should know everything I do too. But the reason that your God is just as stupid as you are is because he is who you are. And he is no more than you are. In fact, he is less than you are, because his existence depends entirely on you and your belief in him. You might get wise one day and He'll just go away, vanishing in a puff of logic. And if that ever happens, you will become more tolerant and more curious. That's a statistical trend that we've noticed that usually happens with pastors when they give up their faith.
It would be foolish for you to say Thomas Miller doesn't exist as a person unless you've met every person in the world.
But when you're talking about God, you're not talking about a normal person. We're talking about an extraordinary person, meaning that your evidence must be that much more profound. Finding a Facebook account is good enough evidence for regular people like Thomas Miller, but you'll need a whole lot more than that for a highly dubious and contested claim like you're God. So would it be foolish of you to say that Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill don't exist? Is it foolish for you to say that Vishnu doesn't exist? 800 million Hindus say that he does. That's more than every Protestant Christian denomination combined with Mormons, JWs, and everyone except the Catholics. Would it be foolish of you to say that Santa Claus doesn't exist? After all, he has more in common with Jesus than you'll likely admit. Have you ever been to the North Pole? Because you said that if you haven't been everywhere and you haven't looked everywhere and you don't know absolutely everything, then you can't even definitively say that Godzilla doesn't exist. Have you searched the entirety of the Marianas Trench? And if you had, maybe he wasn't home at that moment and you missed him. Even though Godzilla is obviously fictional and his existence would defy the laws of physics just like your God, you think your inability to find or disprove Godzilla proves that it's possible that he could exist. That's according to your logic. That's why the world doesn't use your logic. That's why positive claims require positive evidence, and unsubstantiated assertions of impossible nonsense like gods and monsters do not warrant serious consideration.
But it's not foolish for me to tell you Thomas Miller does exist because I have met him and I've talked with him and he's my friend.
The Nobel Prize-winning mathematician John Forbes Nash met his college roommate Charles Herman when he started at university, and he spoke with his friend frequently for many years afterward, even though no one else could ever see Charles Herman. Nor could anyone see many of Nash's other friends that he alone met and talked with. Even when other people interceded to say, "Who are you talking to, John? There's no one there." So, having heard your evidence of God, I'm inclined to ask, is he in the room with us right now? And do you have any other friends that only you can see or hear? There was a moving scene in the movie about John Nash wherein his wife had to explain to him that all these people he knew and had been talking to for years didn't really exist. He rejected this, of course, because he could not consider the truth, just like you can't either. A few years ago, the National Alliance on Mental Illness defined delusion as a persistent false belief that is maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary, to falsely claim something even when there is evidence otherwise. And what makes these beliefs delusional is that they don't change when the person is presented with conflicting information. The beliefs remain fixed even when the facts contradict them. By this definition, your religion definitely qualifies as a delusion. And for that reason, NAMI later changed their definition, saying that it's not a delusion if it is shared by the surrounding community. Literally the special pleading fallacy that it's okay when religion does it. But that still shows that the old adage is correct, that when one person has a delusion, it's called insanity. But when many people have a delusion, it's called religion. It starts when you encourage prayer, actively talking to your imaginary friend. It doesn't have to be a god either. It could be your spirit totem or the ghosts of your dead ancestors or aliens from outer space communicating telepathically. It could even be your soccer ball, Wilson. The point is, if you talk to any imaginary character long enough, eventually they'll start talking back.
In the same way, this is what the studies show us today. Over 1 billion people in the world today, over 1 billion, say that they have met God, that they've talked with him and he's their friend.
I was not able to find any such study. I don't believe there is one, not an actual study, not that says all the things you just said yours did. And this again demonstrates how you have the burden of proof to produce whatever poll or study you're talking about. My negative response to your positive and unsupported assertion does not require any negative evidence. I don't have a burden to prove that your cited study does not exist. We take for granted that it doesn't until you show otherwise. If you do produce such a study that says all the things you said this one did, then that won't make me a liar. But if you don't produce the study when you should, because you can't, because there isn't one, that will make you a liar. The reason I'd like to see whatever nonsense propaganda you're really referring to is because I know something about religious statistics, and if there really were 1 billion people claiming that they met God and talked with him and he's their friend, then I would have to say that at least most of them are friends with a different God than yours. And just for one famous example, look at George Harrison of the Beatles. He believed in a personal God, and he said that if one chants the mantras with devotion, Lord Krishna would visibly appear and speak to him in an audible voice. He said that it's pointless to believe in something without proof, and Krishna consciousness and meditation are methods where you can actually obtain God perception. You can actually see God and hear him, play with him. It might sound crazy, but he's actually there, actually with you. So, Pastor Morris, should we believe George Harrison, that his God is actually with him? Is it enough that Harrison said that he knows Krishna exists because he met him, he talked with him, and they're friends? How is it possible that Lord Krishna talks to George Harrison and millions of other Hindus, and Jesus talks to you? One possibility, the only possibility, is that neither of you has ever actually met or talked with or befriended either of these imaginary beings. So why do both of you have these fictitious friends? For the same reason that millions of other people have met and talked with and befriended their gods. I know a professional medical technician who lives not 2 miles from me who worships the Egyptian cat-headed goddess Bast because she appeared to him visibly, she embraced him physically, and she spoke to him audibly, asking him to become her disciple, which of course he did, because how do you say no when a topless goddess shows up in your bedroom? So this guy and George Harrison both know their God exists for the same reasons that you don't really know your God exists either. It's all in your imagination. It is literally make-believe. It's not real. Faith is inherently autodeceptive. It can cause you to see, hear, and feel any God from any pantheon. Whatever religious traditions you were raised with will most likely recur in adulthood. Faith can convince you that your spiritual form can project out of your body and that you can remember past life experiences and commune with spirit guides on a Ouija board. And faith can also convince you that you are receiving telepathic transmissions from extraterrestrial reptiles or thetans giving you secret information about the Illuminati. None of that has to be real at all for you to experience it all through faith, if you could just believe hard enough. A dear old friend of mine who became a Southern Baptist minister told me to fake it till you make it. Just keep telling yourself it's true until you believe it.
God exists.
That is a positive claim, and I'm still waiting to hear positive evidence. I'll accept anything that qualifies as evidence, any body of objectively verifiable facts that are positively indicative of and or exclusively concordant with your God hypothesis over any other available explanation. So, what evidence do you have to justify what you say you know? Now, if you'd only said you believe that God exists, then you're off the hook. But you stated that as a fact. So if it's not really a fact and you don't really know, then you're lying. Citing facts that are not facts, pretending to know things you don't know, are both lies. Yet, precisely those lies are what all religions are based on. But what if the truth mattered more than whatever you'd rather pretend? What if you didn't want to be fooled into believing anything that wasn't evidently true? Your first step in the pursuit of truth is to question and seriously challenge your faith.
Now, years ago, I met this guy who told me he was an atheist, and I said to him, can we talk about that and still be friends? And can I give you a different point of view? And he said, yes. He said, but I'd like to keep the conversation on an intelligent level, a scientific level. That was meat in front of my eyes. I said, oh, that's great. That's what I want to do too.
No, it isn't. That was never true for you. You saw him as a mark, an easy target, someone you could befuddle with your word game.
And I shared with him what I've shared with you. And we got down to the end, and I said to him, so you can't tell me there is no God, but I can tell you there is a God. And he said, I think you're right. So I guess I'm an agnostic, not an atheist.
So he asked you to keep it on an intelligent and scientific level. But instead of honoring that wish, you told him what you told us, wherein you never provided any of the scientific evidence you promised and that we're still waiting for. Instead, you contradicted science using fallacious logic to misrepresent what atheism is. Now, I admit there are a handful of self-identified philosophers who do not represent mainstream atheism who like the assertion definition that you use, for reasons that I find to be indefensible, inapplicable, and inaccurate. To me, it's only good for starting pointless arguments, and I think that's why those philosophers, and only philosophers, like that definition. But the original and still consistent, current, common, working definition throughout the atheism movement is and always was a lack of belief. Because atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theists define themselves as believers. Thus, it follows that atheists are unbelievers. We are without belief in God, just as agnostics are without knowledge of God. Anyone who is not convinced that an actual deity really exists is atheist. Beyond that, they might be agnostic or anti-theist, doesn't matter for this discussion. So you misled that poor sap right from the start. What happened next?
And I said, okay, so let me just ask you a question. If God does exist, would you like to meet him? And I remember watching, now I'm talking about like, not in the metaphysical, but in the spiritual world. I remember watching his heart turn, just like that. I've seen it a lot because I've led a lot of people to Jesus. And there's a point in the conversation where you can see their heart go, and I saw it. And I'm sitting there talking to him, and I said, if God exists, would you like to meet him? And he was silent for about a minute. His eyes filled up with tears. His lips started quivering. His heart went like that. And here's what he said to me. I'll never forget it. He said, I'd like to meet him right now. I'd like to meet him right now. And I shared with him the gospel, how God didn't want robots, so he gave us a free will that each of us could choose, and how he sent his son to die for us on the cross. And I led him to Christ.
No, you didn't. Sorry. I know you like that story. It makes you feel all squishy and your gutty works. But that's not what really happened. People can be rational, logical, and reasonable, but we can also be emotionally manipulated, leading to very addictive sensations. Supposed supernatural spiritualism appeals to the very same area of the brain as illicit narcotics, which is why those people who are especially fond of drugs also tend to be especially susceptible to religion. That's why so many converted Christians were formerly drug-addicted alcoholics. They're simply trading one addiction for another, with similar effects, but more socially acceptable. Had I been that guy that you're talking about, then as soon as you started in with the Gospels, I would have called you out for having broken your promise. I wanted to meet God right now, and instead of that, you got out your meaningless and self-contradicting storybook. Show me your God. I mean, Christians can't even have free will, logically, for a few reasons. Not if God already knows everything you're going to do before you do it. If everything is preordained and you can't surprise him and ruin his prophecy, then you don't have free will. Especially not if you've got the threat of the hell like a gun to your head, because extortion doesn't allow for a free choice either. And there's a whole lot wrong with God sending his supposed son to be a scapegoat as just one of several conditions for his unconditional love, a sacrifice that never needed to be made because he could have just forgiven us for something that wasn't wrong anyway and that never actually happened in the first place. But those are all topics for a different conversation. So you did not lead anyone to Christ. You only dragged them into your delusion.
When I'd go back and visit and see him 2 or 3 years later, he had won countless people to Christ. And he'd always tell them, I used to be an atheist until I found out you can't be an atheist scientifically.
So he believed a lie this whole time. I want to talk to this guy. Somebody's put me in touch with him, because that's a pet peeve of mine. I was an atheist and didn't know it for like 15 years before I finally found out what that word really meant, because I believed the same lie that you're still telling now, trying to diminish atheism into an unreasonable position, as if we're the ones making indefensible claims, as if we're the ones claiming to know what no one even can know. We've seen how well that works for you, haven't we? You wouldn't bother with an anti-theist. They typically know the science, history, philosophy, and even your own scripture better than you do, and you don't want to know how things really are. So you'd leave the anti-theist alone. Instead, you'd target the average unbeliever. If atheism were just a denial of God proposition, a position which I think requires extensive education, then you would put the burden of proof on them. I can manage that, but your average unbeliever can't. Then, if your unwary target thinks that the only other option is agnosticism, and you misrepresent that too so that he thinks it means that he has to say that he doesn't know, this achieves the illusion of false equivalence, giving a susceptible target the impression that their perfectly reasonable position has somehow been weakened, as if your delusion ever had any comparable validity at all, as if superstition and reason were two sides of the same coin, which they are not. We're literally comparing fact versus fantasy. You cannot admit or allow your quarry to know that atheism simply means that we don't believe you, because that means that you have to come up with a reason why we should. And believers hate the burden of proof like a vampire hates garlic, because you don't have a good reason, which is why you rely on fallacious arguments in lieu of evidence.
And he was leading people to Christ one after the other. His whole life changed.
That's what happens when you take up drugs or religious delusion, both being similarly addictive. That's the reason that former smokers are the most outspoken anti-smokers. That's the reason that former believers are the most outspoken anti-theists. You're telling me that you got your friend high and that he's an addict now, spreading the addiction. If you had heard drug users bragging the same way you have, I'm sure you would have the same reaction to them that I'm having to you. It's not a harmless fantasy either. Religion is a means of manipulation of the masses to extort, support, and secure social, financial, and political power. But why am I telling you that? You've got $50 million in a 4,000-seat stadium sanctuary, so you already know that you are the dopamine dealer for 30,000 congregants and that they will pay a high price for that fix. Drugs and religion are both life-changing, but the same thing happens when you take up education or activism or dedicate yourself to any other passion. The day I finally realized that atheism didn't really mean what you and certain philosophers always told me it meant, the day I realized that label actually applied to me, that was life-changing, because it meant that I'd been lied to all my life and that I should do something to save others from the indignity of being duped by the deliberately misleading misinformation that your ministry is spreading now.
Because he realized there is the possibility of a God, and if there's the possibility, would you like to know him?
Possibility does not mean probability, and even if there was a probability, that wouldn't qualify as knowledge. The reality is there is no possibility, because you have not shown any precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon to indicate that any such possibility even exists. Nor can you, and you already know why you can't.
It isn't real.
Wow, you know, I really enjoyed that. That was awesome. I had insomnia at the beginning of this, not so much now, because I was so riveted and so focused, and I learned something. I hope you guys did too. This has been a really good way to end a day, or in some cases to start a day, I guess. Thank you, Aron. That was fantastic. You'll definitely be using your educational services more and more going forward. So from me to you, till next time, good night. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Aron. Goodbye, everybody. Good night.